Hi, welcome back to your virtual learning space for this, the last video in the series, The Bigger Picture. If you learned something interesting, I encourage you to reach out and teach somebody. So, once again, we're coming back to this very, very simple diagram of my parents' property. And this time we're going to dive into zone 4. We're also going to dive into zone 5, but I don't have any zone 5 on my property. And the zone 4 that I'm talking about in my property is my little meadows. So like I let the grass grow on my parents' property so that it can have its own little flowers and its own little ecosystem. But I'm also talking about the willow tree down the front and the jasmine trees by the front door. So zone 4 is harvested once or twice a year. This is a place where we step in very gently and we can harvest some stuff. So it tends to be forage for wild animals, wild mushrooms, and maintained wild spaces. In that, what I'm talking about is timber trees, which obviously you would only harvest once every 20 years or 30 years, and wild fruit and nuts. So things like fodder. These are things for wild animals to eat that we can also eat. Dave, you had a question.
I'm just hearing a lot of background noise with the microphone. I don't know.
How's that? Perfect. Cool. Right. So, like I said, the little willow down the front of my parents' property, the jasmine growing up the wall by the front door, and my little meadows with all my daisies and my dandelions. These are semi-wild spaces, right? And then zone 5 is wild space. These are places that we never harvest. We make very careful additions to, and we might have paths. But that would be the only system we would put into place here. This is nature's place. We don't try and argue with her here. So in both of these zones, we're going to be encouraging wild. We're going to be encouraging the wild things to come in, right? One of the quickest and best ways to do this is with predator habitat. So predator habitat can take many forms, but two of the ones that I'm going to chat about really quickly are owl boxes and bat boxes, right? The reason that I'm talking about these specifically is because they deal with two pests that we all experience when we go to the woods. So we don't want to have too many mice, rats, small rodents. And we also don't want to have those tiny little flies, the tiny little annoying guys that are hanging around, gnats, and they're just like biting us and all the annoyingness of that. So bats absolutely decimate gnats and mosquitoes. They love them, and they are the most equipped little organisms to take care of them. They really, really take care of them quite quickly. So by putting in something as simple as a bat box, like the one that's in the picture here, we can give them a habitat. We give them a place to live, and then they can go on to live there and be a productive part of our system. They're obviously dropping guano as well, which is very good for our soil. And then, of course, we can put in owl boxes, which is, I mean, like, owls are awesome. But owls are, they tend to have very little habitat in our world. They tend not to be, they're not as able to occupy human spaces as other birds are. Things like house sparrows really, really don't care if humans are around. They will occupy the eaves of your house, but an owl won't. An owl needs a little bit of habitat. It needs a little bit of help. Um, in the encouraging the wild in our zone 4 and zone 5, we do need to support the soil. So we still need to be building soil and helping nature to build more efficient microbial life in the soil. Like I said, the soil is the base of all ecosystems. It is the bottom rung of the ladder. And if the bottom rung of the ladder isn't there, we can't climb it. So without supporting our soil, we're just amending. We're just helping in the wrong direction. We're not helping the system to be more self-supported. We're actually crippling the system by helping it at the wrong level. Amanda, you had a question?
How'd you know that? What do you put in the bat box? How do they know to go there? You put something in it.
No, no. It's literally about the shape for a bat box. So what bats like to do, as we all know, they hang upside down to sleep. But they need a very protected environment to do that. And what they like, animals will find habitat. And if you make them a pretty house like this, they will acknowledge it. They will move to it immediately. It's like as if we said, like, the two of us walked into a housing estate and we noticed that a house was empty. You know, you go, oh, cool, that's a place I could live. They will recognize it that quickly. We can also provide wild fodder. We can choose plants and put them into place that are food for our wild animals. So it's important to recognize that obviously we don't want to be introducing too many non-natives. This is a debate that I could get into for hours and hours, but we don't want to be putting in too many non-native plants because, well, number one, our wildlife mightn't recognize them. But also, we want to be providing the right kind of food for animals. So one of the problems that they have in America with the deer is that the deer haven't got the normal type of fodder that they're used to. The American chestnut used to form a huge part of the deer diet, but it was wiped out by a blight in the early 1900s, I'm going to say. I'm not 100% sure on that, but it was wiped out. Like the American chestnut was completely a disease wiped it out, and that was spread by beetles. And in the process, we wiped out, or we didn't do it, but nature wiped out that food source for deer. And now deer are a huge problem for a lot of American forests and a lot of American gardens. Like deer will come up in your place and eat all your stuff, everything. Grafting is another. It's a delicate thing that we can do, and that's where we cut a branch on a tree that supports this kind of system, and we can attach a branch from a different species of the same, from a different genus of the same species. So one of the most common is to graft apples. So crab apples grow really well in Ireland, but crab apples aren't particularly tasty. What we can do with a crabapple tree, though, once we get it to a certain size, we can graft other species, other genera of apple onto it. So we could have a crabapple rootstock growing Granny Smiths and the red and green ones. We could be growing all sorts of different apples on the same plant. And we do that by grafting. And this is a very simple process, but it also takes a lot of understanding. So it's definitely something you can look into on your own. When it comes to encouraging the wild, grafting can really help us to diversify, to create more resilience in our system. Gentle touch. So we are being very careful about any additions we make to zone 4 and 5. We want them to be semi-wild or wild. In the case of wild, any additions we're making are only going to be soil food. We're not going to make any other additions. Like we're going to set up predator habitat. That's fine. We're going to set up things that support the system, but we're not going to introduce random things that we would do in our own zone 1 or zone 2. We can do experimental things in our zone 1 and zone 2 because those things are under our control. But if we're moving out to zone 4 and 5, we're trying to let nature do as much as she can to recover her system. Cool. So coppicing and pollarding. Coppicing and pollarding are systems of cutting a tree that make the life of the tree longer. Now that might sound counterintuitive, but as I explain, it will make more sense. So here we have a tree. Here we have a tree fully grown on the left-hand side of the diagram. And then when we cut it, that looks like a super destructive thing to do. But as we move further along the diagram, we can see that it regrows with all these little shoots. And by doing this, we've actually lengthened the life of the tree. So here's an example of coppicing. this is kind of halfway between coppicing and pollarding. So coppicing is where we cut it down low, and pollarding is where we cut it kind of at head height. You've probably seen a lot of pollarding on the side of roads. This is where a tree will look like this. It'll look very destroyed, but we're actually enhancing the life of the tree. So coppiced willows can live for up to 500 years. That's nearly 4 times their regular lifespan. And that means that we could have a coppiced willow grove on a property that could have 5 generations or even 6 or 7 generations of our family with the same trees, right? There's a German coppice beech that can live for up to 800 years. And they know this because there is 800-year-old evidence of these trees. So they're like, if you follow the literature of these properties, they have been harvesting the same trees for 800 years, which is massive. These form a good system for fuel for rocket stoves. Remember, we were talking about rocket stoves a couple of weeks ago. So if we set up a system where we had willows, 5 or 6 willows, that we were harvesting on a yearly basis or a biennial basis every 2 years, we could have all the fuel we need forever in our terms, because we don't live that long. But we're doing it by enhancing the tree. We're getting our firewood without killing a tree. Something that's miraculous is that when we cut the top, the tree itself prunes the bottom. So it prunes its own roots. And what that does is it creates what we call compost corridors in the soil. Because it's cut off the circulation, it's cut off the life to the roots die, rot in the soil. But what they've done before that is they've rooted into it. They've made their own little path through the soil. So by cutting off the starch to that root, it rots in place. And it creates, like I said, a compost corridor in the soil. That's compost under the ground that we couldn't do something as effective as that. Conserving resources is obviously what's happening here. We are conserving the resource. We are using that area that the tree is living in for a long, long, long time. We're also going to be watering that tree as much. We're going to be mulching that tree as much. We're going to feed that tree as much as we would one tree, but it is living for the life of 2 or 3 trees of its own genera, right? Any questions about coppicing and pollarding? Yeah, Dave?
Is it so you plant a tree, it grows to maturity, and then you coppice it or pollard it.
Mm-hmm.
And do you only do that once and that's it, or can you do it again? And
it's again and again and again and again. You can see from the one that's here, they form like a ball. They form like a mushroom top on them when you do it. That's because as it comes up, the first time you cut it, it's just like a stump, like you see in the diagram here. But then the next time you cut it, it looks more like the picture, because it's grown out again, and we've cut it again, and it'll keep getting more and more mushroomy. It'll keep getting like a big old, it's like a scar, but at the same time, we view it as a scar. The tree doesn't view it the same way. If it goes on to have a longer life because we're doing this, isn't that better for the tree? Right? So, permaculture ethics and principles, right? Coming right back around to the intro to permaculture that I did a couple of weeks ago. This is our tie back, right? So, if you've seen my intro to permaculture, you'll have seen the diagram in the middle before. And we're talking about Earthcare, which is care of all the living systems on the planet. This is how we are encouraging or supporting the ability of life to thrive. We've got People Care, which is supporting us. We need things, we need resources to survive and thrive, and we need to put those into the system. And then Fair Share, so that the surplus is spread amongst all the elements of a system, so that everything gets a share of the surplus, right? And when I was talking about those, I mentioned in passing that there are also 12 principles. And now I'm going to go into the principles because I think having covered the material I have in these set of videos, we can understand these things a little bit more clearly, right? I'm going to start off with number 1, which is at the 1 o'clock on the clock, right? This is observe and interact, taking the time to engage with nature so that we can design the solution that suits our particular needs, right? This is about using all 5 of our senses, sitting and being in the nature around us, looking at what does work, what is already growing, what is happening, how can I help support what's working, how can I disencourage what's not working, right? Number 2, we've talked a lot about catching and storing energy. This is where we collect resources when they are abundant and save them for when we need them. This is everything from batteries on an electricity regulating system or an electricity producing system, right down to things like fermenting. We get a lot of cabbage at once, and if we make sauerkraut with that cabbage, we've essentially got cabbage for months without any other interaction, for want of a better word. We have stored that food for later. Number 3 is obtain a yield. So we can't work on an empty stomach. We need to get useful rewards for our work. That's not selfish, but if we design it into the system, it can be productive. It can be something that helps to reinforce our system. Our system is not happy if we fall over because we're hungry. Number 4, apply self-regulation and accept feedback. So discouraging inappropriate activities so that the systems of nature can function well and thrive. This is about accepting feedback from nature. So like if I planted a mango tree in Ireland, it wouldn't work. We need to self-regulate that point. We can't grow a mango tree here. Mango tree doesn't grow. That doesn't mean that we force it to grow. That doesn't mean that we give it more ingredients, we give it more love, we give it more manure and mulch, and we're like, come on, you can do it. That is completely against the point. If it's not working, take nature's advice, step back. Right, number 5, use and value renewable resources and services. So this is a picture of a horse, and that's because of 2 things, right? We can look at a horse as a way for the next 15 years or 20 years, depending on the life of the horse, for us to get around, right? We can use it as transport. We can also make use of it as a cart pulling animal, right? So it can pull a cart around, it can pull a plow. We could also look at a horse as a food source. I know it's not like a common way to think about it, but we could technically eat the horse. So the idea is that we want to use things in a non-consuming way. We don't want to consume the system. We want to use it in a regenerative way. If we can value,
right, kind of like point 3, obtain a yield.
Kind of like point 3, obtain a yield, exactly. So these are all linked. These are all parts of the same thing. And it's a clock. It just keeps on turning. It's going to follow all the way around. So number 6 is produce no waste. And the most simple way to put this is waste not, want not. The picture is a worm because worms are incredibly efficient at processing organic material. Now, we would normally call that waste, but they call it food. And they give us products, so there is no waste in that system. Again, mushrooms would be a good example of this, having talked about mushrooms only a moment ago. Okay, so number 7, design from patterns to details. So if you remember the first two videos that we did, we were talking about sectors and zones. So like we were talking about the biggest scale right down into the smaller, right? So if we're starting with the idea of a zone, that's a pattern. What we put into the zone is the details. We can't start with the details and build the zone around it. We have to identify the zone first. Number 8 is integrate rather than segregate. So the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts is the quickest way to describe this. And it's about accepting that all these different things can work together. This is tied very closely with using value diversity. So we want to encourage everything to work together. The picture is supposed to be an overhead view of 5 people sitting down holding hands. I don't really see that picture personally, but that's what it's supposed to be. Number 9 is use small and slow solutions. So everything about my parents' property is small designs. They're small systems, little tiny bits supplementing our existence. If we take on too much too quickly, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, right? Slow and steady wins the race. We don't want to take on too much because we don't want to be overwhelmed. Number 10 is use and value diversity. So diversity breeds resilience. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. We want to have multiple things providing multiple solutions and a lot of different things supporting different needs and satisfying each other. Again, like I said, this kind of comes with integrate versus segregate. Yes, Amanda, you have a question?
So, there's still that background noise. It's just for future ones that you're doing.
I'm surprised that this is the first time it's happened, to be honest. So use and value diversity. Number 11, use the edge and value the marginal. So like I said in the first video, the edge is where all the interesting stuff happens. At the interface between media is where the diversity is really like super abundant. The analogy I gave is like land meets river, and the bank is a whole system of its own, right? So there are things that live on the bank that don't live on land, don't live on the river, they only live on the bank. So in the interaction between two media, another system is formed. And using and valuing those edges is of utmost importance. We also want to create more edge. And that's what I talked about with the keyhole garden. That's what I talked about when we were covering herb spirals. The edge is where everything happens. And the last one is creatively use and respond to change. Not seeing things as they are, but seeing what they could be. And the picture for this is a butterfly, because obviously if we didn't know what a caterpillar turns into, a caterpillar wouldn't be as beautiful. But when we look at a caterpillar, we can see the butterfly. That's about the creative use and response to change. Careful interaction and observation, it all feeds back into itself again from there, right? So this is a constant cycle. The more we apply all of these systems to our life, all of these little tiny changes, the better it becomes incrementally. And these things become self-regulating, self-supporting. The system reinforces itself. The more we do it, the better we get at it. The better we get at it, the more we do it. It just follows along. I cannot tell you how important this particular system is. So this comes from the Permaculture Principles by David Holmgren. David Holmgren is one of the co-originators of permaculture. Him and Bill Mollison kind of came up with it together, and they had a split. They both went in different directions, but they both came up with amazing, valuable material. Bill Mollison did not come up with this. He came up with the Permaculture Design Manual, which is like big. But David Holmgren took the approach of making the idea more simple and more applicable from that perspective. Now he has 2 or 3 books, and the Permaculture Principles is a fantastic textbook as well. I recommend that you actually can go on his website. I think it's just called permacultureprinciples.com. And there's a load of songs to go with each of these steps on the clock. And they are amazing. Like I cannot tell you how important it is to understand these. And that's why I wanted to bring them up right at the end, which is where we are. So thank you guys so much. It's been such a pleasure teaching you. I hope that I've shared enough knowledge that you really understand and can be excited about permaculture like I am. Thank you so much for investing your time into this program. I hope you got your money's worth. I am currently working on new material, so subscribe to stay in touch and reach out if you would like to learn even more about permaculture and natural building. Have a fantastic day.